Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, Welcome, everybody. Today we're hosting Miguel Fernandes. He is a PhD candidate at, let's see if I get this right, Marine and Environmental Science Center, but also affiliated with the University of Lisbon. He's done a lot of he is doing some really interesting work on marine spatial planning in respect to climate change vulnerability. And he published a really interesting paper on that, which I think is going to make up part of his presentation. And this partly how I found out about him, as I saw this paper come up, and it is going to cover a lot of the different methodologies for this assessment. So that's great. It'll be really interesting to see. And I would also like to say Miguel has a big storm going on in his area, and he has had some power issues. If we lose him for more than a couple of minutes, then maybe we'll just reschedule. But so far so good. So let's see how it goes. So Miguel, if you want to take it from here, go for it.
Okay. Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank you all for being here, and also thank you, Gregor, for the opportunity and the invite. So, talking a little bit about what I'm going to present here, these are some of the outputs of one of our projects, where we try to make an overview of the existing climate-related vulnerability and risk assessments of main ocean uses. And we did so not only to see the existing gaps and the major trends, but also to trying to find new steps to make a risk assessment of trying to assess the vulnerability of marine spatial plan and marine management plans around Europe and in Portugal. So with that, this work was done by me and my colleagues Carina Vieira da Silva and Catarina Frazão Santos. So let's start. Briefly introducing that vulnerability and risk assessments have been used in a wide variety of contexts, from health to nature and even economics. And due to this variety of contexts, there is some doubts regarding what definitions to use sometimes and what are the elements of risk that we should use. And also, there are some doubts or where the steps to follow, what methodologies we need to use. Instead of this, they are very helpful and they are being also increasingly used to address climate change effects on the ocean and on the marine environment. And this is very important because we can understand how, for example, different ecosystem services, different human communities, and different maritime activities are impacted by climate change. And this is very important to inform and support these management plans around the world, contributing to conservation and also to a sustainable use of the ocean. And now I'm trying to give a brief description of what these management plans do. And one of the most known is Marine Spatial Plan or Maritime Spatial Plan in Europe. And these plans are a public process that tries to allocate in a temporal and spatial way all the maritime activities that could occur in a national space. So these type of processes and public processes, uh, the origin is that they can be flexible and adaptive. But to do so and to be sustainable under a changing climate, they need information on where changes in ocean uses and ecosystems are most relevant. So risk assessments and vulnerability assessments can help us in doing so. However, there are few studies that try to assess climate-related risk of main ocean uses together. They try to only specify one or two, for example. So, in such context, we try to understand, so what are the main trends? What are the main limitations of these existing assessments? And what are the potential pathways to overcome them? So, following these issues, we develop a systematic literature review where we analyze different aspects of the existing vulnerability and risk assessments of main ocean uses to climate change. We analyzed over 314 scientific references until the year 2020, where we identify, for example, the different ocean uses, and here we considered the ocean activities more referred in the European reports and also in the Portuguese Marine Special Plan, like fisheries, marine conservation, tourism, ports, aquaculture, maritime transport, and others. And then also the most known climate related drivers of change, being sea level rise, extreme events, shifts in currents and winds, ocean acidification, and so on. Also, we try to identify the existing references to ocean planning and the blue economy to make a proxy of an integrated vision of the ocean, because these management plans try to allocate these different activities, and the blue economy being the conjunction of different economic sectors around the maritime space. So with that, we also divided in two types of publications that we found out. The first one was the conceptual publications, more theoretical works that still define vulnerability and risk assessments, and try to share a light of different elements and descriptions. And then the case study based publications, where there is a explicit and specific risk assessment. So in this part of the studies, in the case study based publications, we also analyze the spatial scale from local to global, the elements considered being vulnerability and risk itself, but also other elements like exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And then the dimensions that could be focused, like ecological, social, economic, or a combination of all of these. And also the type of indicator, if it was qualitative indicators, quantitative, or also a mix between both. So we performed this literature review on Web of Science because it's known for carrying out several literature reviews. With that, the first findings that we observed was that although risk and vulnerability are relatively known terms and exist for quite a while, the climate-related vulnerability and risk assessments regarding marine environment are recent, and we can see an increase in the number of publications from 2007 onwards. And this is linked with the publication of the fourth and fifth Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment reports. These are reports very important and tries to also tackle these issues of risk and vulnerability assessments and climate change. And we can see a very substantial growth between the publication of the fourth assessment report that was in 2007 and the fifth assessment report that was in 2014. And this is also found in other reviews. For example, there is a review by Zhang that they found out that they tried to analyze all climate-related vulnerability and risk assessments, terrestrial and of the marine environment, and also found an increase on the number of publications after the release of these assessment reports. Then, when we look at the different ocean activities and the different climate-related drivers of change, we can see that fisheries, marine conservation, and tourism are the most referred ones, and it's quite expected because fisheries is one of the most traditional ocean uses and is very important in local communities, in very local communities, being from developed countries or also small developing island states, for example. And then tourism is also very important in these coastal settlements, mainly because of its economic importance. Then marine conservation, it was also expected to be higher, and we found out that it could be a little underestimated here, because marine conservation is not considered ocean use and ocean activity per se. It's rather a use of the ocean space. So some type of publications could be missing out of this review. But then we can also see something that is interesting, that is marine renewable energy is still not so referred. This is because it's a relatively recent ocean activity, and also there are being several studies trying to understand the potential of renewable energy offshore also, and there is a recognition of the importance to mitigate climate change, but there are not so much studies regarding the vulnerability of climate change in this sector. Then moving on to the climate-related drivers of change, we can also see that extreme events and sea level rise are one of the most referred, and this is also again because uh, most of the human population settles in coastal areas, so these drivers are very important, and a knowledge also in, for example, urban assessments, giving the risk of the increasing frequency of extreme events and also sea level rise. But then one interesting thing that we noted is that ocean acidification and deoxygenation are not so referred, and these two, together with ocean warming, are known as the deadly trio. So they have a lot of impacts to different species around the world and different habitats, but here are not so referred. And the last two can be explained by two major findings. That is, for example, some of these sectors are not so affected by these drivers, and also we can see that, okay, but fisheries and marine conservation are very referenced, so why ocean acidification and deoxygenation are not so talked about? And this is because some of the studies refer only to a specific driver, and in much of the cases is, for example, to ocean warming. So we can try to understand why there are not much more studies about these two drivers. Then, regarding also the references to ocean planning and the blue economy, we can see that there is not so much references to these terms, and this is because different ocean uses tend to be analyzed individually on a sector by sector basis, and these studies try to assess the vulnerability to climate change, to fisheries, for example, only, or to aquaculture only. They don't try to assess several ocean uses at the same time, so there is also lack of references to this type of terms. Then, when we focus only on the case study-based publications, we found out that local studies are the most used. And this is also because of the recent improvements in tools and approaches that are used to assess climate-related risk and vulnerability on these specific locations. And also, there is a knowledge that climate-related risk assessments performed in a local and more specific way, they tend to have more robust results, because climate change will have different response in different areas given the different context of the specific locations. So that's why there are a lot of studies being performed in a local way and in a more specific way. Then we can see that global and national studies are not so referred, and this is also because of the challenge that is this to perform these assessments, and also the availability of data sometimes. And another thing is that national studies are also can be also an underestimated here, because national reports sometimes have these risk assessments, but they do not appear in these platforms like the Web of Science. So it is expected that there is a lot of national studies or more national studies, so it is underestimated here, maybe. Then assessing the different elements of risk and vulnerability, we can see, of course, that they are quite well referenced, and especially risk and vulnerability, but we can see also that exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity are not so referred. And this is because there is a difficulty in trying to find the right elements depending on the specific target that we have to analyze the risk and to assess risk. So that's why they are not so referred. And also adaptive capacity, which can be alarming because it's very important, because adaptive capacity is part also of the response to risk. So it's something that we also need to take in consideration. Then finally, regarding the, the type of dimensions that we use and the type of indicators, that was very interesting to note that most of the studies try to understand the system as a whole. Although they are quite specific, they try, for example, to assess only fisheries or only tourism, they try to understand the different dimensions related to the activity, being social, economic, or ecological. And to do so, they need to use a mix of qualitative and quantitative indicators. So that's why most of the studies try to understand these systems as a whole, which I think is also very interesting to note. So in conclusion, from the review that we perform, we confirm that there is a really large variety of frameworks and approaches that can be used to develop climate-related vulnerability and risk assessments. But at the time, we noted that the most accepted and used definition was the one from the fourth IPCC assessment report, where vulnerability was the result of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. But also at the time, we discovered that there was a tendency to uh, shift this framework to the newest report of the EPCC at the time, that was the fifth assessment report, where they try to define risk as the combination between hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, being vulnerability constituted by sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And right now, we also believe that this will be one of the most used and accepted definitions, because in the most recent report, the sixth EPCC assessment report from 2022, they stick with the same framework, and they also try to understand the importance of this framework and how we can respond to risk, and then create cycles of adaptation. So we are not saying that this is the right way or the right framework, but is one of the most used and accepted definitions and frameworks to assess risk. And this is very helpful because of different contexts, different objectives. So it is important to know what are the major or the biggest accepted frameworks. Then we also highlight that further research is needed, particularly on the development of cross-sectoral studies, because here talking about mathematics, marine spatial planning will need this information across the different sectors and not only one sector or two sectors, because it's very important to know what is the risk in the different areas to climate change, and what are the major threats to climate change, to try to respond and to try to adapt. And because yes, MSP is very flexible and adaptive, but we need to improve how we can use these type of frameworks to make it more sustainable and to try to make the use of the ocean space in a more sustainable way. And then finally is that literature reviews like this are very important to identify the existing gaps and limitations, but also to provide a big picture of what are the major trends, what are the most talked or referenced uses or definitions, and what are the next steps that we can take to improve this thematic. And I think it's very important to perform literature reviews in this type of subjects and thematics. So I finish here my presentation, hopefully without blackouts, so I'm still here, and thank you all. You have the QR code for my article, and yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel. That was great. And you didn't lose power, so perfect. At least we got your presentation recorded. I'm just going to pause the recording now, and then we'll move on to the question
Okay.
question portion.